Hi guys, so welcome to the build video for the ImmersionRC XuGong V2 Pro Quadcopter. So anyone who's seen the unboxing video would have recognised most of the parts laid out in front of us. Basically, pretty much everything you see in front of us here is going to be used to build this quadcopter. I'm going to be using DJI E300 kit for ESCs, motors and propellers. I'm going to be using the DJI NAZA V2 with GPS. We've got the PMUv2 here and the LED. For my receiver, in my own little cage here, I've actually got the ImmersionRC Easy UHF, which I'm going to be using in PPM mode, so there's only one cable that actually has to go to it. And then for my video transmitter, I'm going to be using an ImmersionRC, surprise surprise, 600mW 5.8 transmitter, all basically purpose built and designed for this frame. So the other parts that we've got in front of us, like I say, if you haven't watched the unboxing video, I go into quite a bit of detail on what we've got. However, basically we've got the fold out arms, the aluminium extruded fold out arms that we've got here. We've then got the actual frame itself, the carbon fibre frame underneath here. We've got the PCB / power distribution. This is actually going to be mounted upside down, I believe. This is going to be the top, that's going to actually be the bottom, so we've just got to bear in mind that all the soldering and everything needs to be sorted out beforehand, before we get everything mounted. That's probably going to be a bit fiddly, and obviously I will deal with the soldering and everything in a separate part of this video. Moving on from that, we've then got 4 rubber feet, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we've then got the anti-vibration dampeners here. We've then got the little clips that prevent the anti-vibration dampeners from releasing the frame underneath the arms, so there's no worries there. We've got 4 slightly larger 2.5mm hex bolts. These actually hold the frame to the power distribution board. Then we've got 24 of these little nuts with encapsulation devices, and we've got 24 bolts that go with them. These bolts are using the 2mm hex, so you want to get yourself a 2mm hex, and also you want to have available to you a 2.5mm hex, and that actually will do the larger bolts here onto the frame. You'll also be using the 2.5mm hex, I believe, for the motors and putting them on. So you should have everything covered with just those two hex devices. So the first thing that I would recommend that you do is, number one, count up everything. Like I say, I've got 24 of each of these. And the next thing that I've done is, this is the actual, hopefully this will get in focus. This is what I'm calling a nut encapsulation device, or encapsulator. So you've got a little clip there. You can see there's a flat bottom and a hollow top. So we then take our nylock nut, nylock facing upwards, and all we do is we slide it. Come on. There we go. We slide it into there, and you can see that's now all snug. And I have done that on all 24 of them, because you're going to need to do it. You may find that there are some spares, but just have a count up just in case. And obviously if I find this is the wrong number by the end of this video, I will know. I've actually got some spares because I had the original XuGong, and that uses the same format. So with that in mind, that's basically the setup. So we'll get building. So the first thing we want to deal with is the frame. As you can see, I've got the base here already, and I've already put the feet in. All you got to do, squish them down and just sort of pry them through the holes. So get the feet into the frame. The next thing that we're going to do after that is we're going to build the top half. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the top and the sides together, and then we're going to add the NAZA to the bottom half of the frame, and then we're going to build up. So basically we're going to kind of build it in reverse. Some of you may have seen a previous video where I did the opposite to this, where I actually built the bottom half with the side walls, and then I kind of slotted the top onto it. Both ways will work. After reverse engineering this and doing this a couple of times over, I found that this way is probably going to be your easiest way of doing it. Both ways do work. The reason that I've redone it onto this revision 2 version is there were some problems with the a couple of GPS errors caused by using a NAZA V2, which we'll get into later. Don't worry about it for the moment. There's a reason why that meant a frame rebuild. However, best bet, get the feet into the bottom of the frame, put that to one side for the moment, and we're going to just work on putting the top one together. And all you need to do is you need to bear in mind that these bits here, these little bits that stick out, they are going to mate to the bottom of the frame, and they will actually go in the rubber feet. As you can see there, they kind of slide in there. So that's the bottom. So all we need to do in which case is take the frame like this and slot it together grab the encapsulated nut, make sure you've got the plastic side is going to be up like so. Grab yourself a bolt and then tighten up. I would suggest not doing it fully tight until you've actually comfortable with where they all go. So we can do that again on the rest of these. I'm actually going to leave this one personally because I'm going to be using that hole to fit my GPS, but I'll get onto that for you guys who aren't going to use that. If you aren't going to use a fold down GPS stalk, then you don't have to follow what I've done there. Okay, so now we can tighten all of these up so they are nice and firmly done. Obviously you will be able to get to these from the top anyway. The ones that won't be easy to get to when you finish are these two here, so bear that in mind, that once the PDB board goes over the top of that, you're not going to be able to get to those. And again, just to come back to this, the reason I've left this one off is because eventually what I will be using an encapsulated nut like so. Like that, but I have a fold down GPS, and basically that's got a thread in the bottom of it, and I'm going to be putting that in that hole there and tightening it up there. If you've got a standard GPS, they will be these 4 holes here, and I'll show you that in a moment. Anyway, so that is the top frame now built and good to go. So the next step is obviously optional if you've got the gimbal included with your kit. What I've done here, as you can see, is I've taken the rear 2 motor mount screws out of the ImmersionRC gimbal that comes with it, and I've replaced them with the slightly longer ones that come in the XuGong box. So loosely do those up so you've got a bit of play in it. Then what we're going to want to do, remove the 2 screws that are in the top of here, and we're actually going to be using the 2 screws that you take out of the motor mounts. We're going to reuse those ones, so put the longer ones in here and then keep hold of the ones you took out, and we're going to use these for the 2 slots up here. So all we do, again, slot the top frame like this so it mounts up. Now because you've got the 2 at the back here, these 2 here are loose, slide everything up until everything's pushing nice and snugly up against here. Then grab the bolts that you've taken out of the rear motor housing and screw through the top frame until they are down. Now what I would advise, I've put 1 in there. If you intend to use a flight camera, and the best flight camera that I've found so far is the Fat Shark 700 TVL for this particular frame. Reason being, it comes with this frame mount, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that second hole and I'm just going to put the frame for the camera on that, and I'm going to just use a little washer that I've got. You don't have to, but this will just widen it just enough. So this is the bolt that we've taken out of the rear motor mount, and I'm actually just going to put that through my Fat Shark 700 TVL frame, and that's going to pass down through, and we want that nice and tight. Okay, so you can see now I've got the frame there, and in fact what I can show you is what the camera will look like once we slide it in there. And I'll just grab a little grub screws . I'll leave those off for the moment. Anyway, so that's what it's going to look like with the camera actually mounted on it. Obviously once I've got the screws in, it's going to be a bit higher up, and that's going to give us the flight camera. And then this wire, which is actually part of the XuGong kit, this one will go into the PDB board, and that gives us the switchable between the two cameras whilst in flight. So next step is these little side pods. So a little side pod here with your gimbal and your front bulkhead. So if you haven't used a gimbal, you'll have your front bulkhead on at this point in time. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slot that up and then in, and then that's slotted in, and then we just want to put our nuts on here. So encapsulating nut in there. And then we've got another hole here on the top, and we're going to put another one in there. And opposite side. Oh, there goes the camera. Like so. Now on the other side, so this is the side that, if you've got the gimbal, has all the connectors on. The other side we're going to be fitting our ImmersionRC video transmitter, if you have one. Now as you can see here, all I've done is I've just put a couple of cable ties around, and I've put them through the 4 holes so that it fits nice and snug between those 4 holes. I suggest, you can do this after you've built the frame, but I would suggest at this point in time this is a good way to do it. So take a look at the configuration and where they've actually gone round and how far it's pushed forward. What you've got to bear in mind is basically what we're going to do is we're going to slide this in like so, and then we're going to pull down and we're going to slot this into the frame like so. So you can see that slot's gone through there. We've got the hole for the screw, and then we've got the front of it waiting for the antenna. Again, like I say, it's optional whether you choose to do that right at this point in time, but I certainly would suggest it because it gets a little bit fiddly wrapping those cable ties around after you've done it. And believe me, hindsight on this is much easier. When I did the first build of this, I did it afterwards and it was much more of a struggle. Okay, so we just want to put this one screw on here, and that's going to hold everything there. Now the other thing, this is an option, this is one of my own mounts that I make and sell on Shapeways. This is for the NAZA V2 LED, and basically what I'm going to do with that, this is the NAZA V2 LED, and all that happens is you just slide it to one side, right way around, slide it to one side, and you just snap it in, and that is going to then give you access to the USB. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to slide it onto this panel here, and you'll see there's a little groove in it, and then I'm going to put a cable tie between here, this little hole there, and the end here, and that's just going to hold it nice and snugly. That doesn't come with the kit, that's an option, that's my own, that's a D3WEY design option. So if you want to fit that, by all means go to Shapeways and buy one of those. I'm going to pop it on the side there. But anyway, so that's the top frame all done now, and I would suggest at this point, if you do have this camera, mount the camera. I would also suggest at this point, if you are going to use easy UHF or something like that, consider mounting it, because what we can then do, if I just grab mine in here, we can then have this cable, this is going to go to the PDB board, and we can actually route it through the various holes that we want it to go through, so we know it's going to reach. So good option to fit it all like that, which I'm going to do now. Okay, so that is everything all put together. So I've mounted the camera now. The camera is fixed and firm on there. I've also mounted, this is my NAZA V2 LED mount. As you can see, I've put a cable tie around there, strapped it round. That's held it in tight there. We've got the ImmersionRC 600mW VTX all slotted in. Power cable I've routed through this little hole here. The other cable we'll deal with later on when we deal with the PDB board. And then I've got my easy UHF diversity transmitter, receiver on the back here. That's actually, again, that's in one of my cases that I make and sell on Shapeways. So plenty of options there. Just whilst I'm doing flagrant Shapeways options, this is the front mount for the camera, which allows you to fit an ND filter, or in my case a GoPro lens there. So anyway, enough of that. That is the top frame all done. So what we can do is we can now put that to one side. So now let's deal with mounting the PDB to the actual arms. Nothing particularly complicated about this. I'm doing this before doing any soldering. Now this is going to be a personal preference. It may be a case of you don't want to get anywhere near this nice frame with your soldering iron. The reason that I'm doing it, however, is that you've got to consider when you put this on to the frame, your ESCs are going to mount to the frame as well. So the distance and the angles and everything where the soldering goes is going to be somewhat reliant on where the ESCs are in part of that. My original ZuGong, I actually wired it before putting it on the frame, and I found that was actually probably not a good idea, because I ended up with weird angles on all the solders, and it meant bent cables and things like that. So for this time round, what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the frame first. So all we want to do, first and foremost, let's fold the frame out, get the arms out of the way, and you can see we've got the mounting holes here. All we're going to be using is we're going to be using the supplied nuts here. These are 2.5mm hex, and we've also got the larger nuts on the bottom of those. Now I'm going to be using a 7mm spanner, a 7mm socket, which I've got here, just to be able to give me that extra bit of grip on it. Okay, so this is going to mount a specific direction. The front of the frame, if we look at this kind of the dead cat format, the front is that way, and what we want to do is we want to turn the PDB board upside down, so we've got the word ZuGong at the top. That is the front, so the top part here, and then we mount it underneath the frame, and all we want to do is we want to put corner to corner, bolt through the corners, put your fingers down on top of them, flip it over, one nut on there, one nut on there. Okay, then we want to just grab our socket. I'm going to do it side on here. Okay, so you can see there's a little bit of wiggle room there, so I'm going to seat that exactly where I want it to be. I'm going to hold it this way round, and then we'll tighten them up. Okay, so we now have the PDB mounted to the frame. So now we come on to the bit where we've got to start thinking about the soldering. We've also got to think about motor placement, we've got to think about the ESC placement, and how all of that goes together. Now, like I said before, I'm going to be using DJI E300 series, so I've got the E300 motor, I've got this is the bullets that come with the ZuGong, the bullet extensions, and obviously I've got the frame all laid out, everything like that. Now the first thing that you've got to consider is the fact the E300s come with a large amount of this single wire cable basically. Now the placement of the ESCs is going to be about here. So this is basically where it's going to be. Now you can see that actually the terminals, positive and negative here, are only there. So we've got a lot of cable that doesn't really need to be used. Now again, this is going to come down to personal preference. I, for one, am a little bit wary of cutting a cable to this kind of length, purely for the fact that if you get it wrong, or if the soldering goes wrong, and also the distance away from the solder, you don't have a lot of heat dissipation, anything like that. So what I'm going to probably do is I'm going to actually loop the cable round, and I'm going to actually pin it down using either heat shrink or tape around the arm like this. Then I'm going to do the soldering from here. The reason being, if something went horribly wrong, as you can see, I've got a nice amount of cable that I can then use to correct the error. The other thing that I do like to be able to do, as I've mentioned before, is I like to be able to reuse all of these things. So if for whatever reason I didn't really like the XuGong, or I wanted to use my E300s for a new project, then I'd be able to unsolder it and I'd still have a good amount of cable that will hopefully become quite useful in the future on different builds. So that's my personal preference. Many people are going to go the short route. Obviously if you do that, just plan it and really think about it. Okay, so that's the actual ESC placement. Now the other thing to consider is the motor. Obviously the motor is going to go under here. Apologies for the lighting, it's a little bit shadowy on this particular one. So the motor is going to go under there. Obviously we're going to mount that with some bolts and screws. However, when we put the cables through these little holes and through here, okay, you can see that with the motor there and the ESC there, it ain't going to get there. Now you've got to bear in mind that when you actually swing the arms around as well, there needs to be some movement and flexibility, and that's why Immersion have actually included these in the design. So what we're going to do is we're going to put one of these in all of the holes. 1, 2 and 3. Okay, and while that does look like there's quite a bit of excess, you've got to bear in mind, like I say, that there is going to be some movement. So when you swing the arm around, you're going to need this cable to actually be long enough so it will bend around and kind of follow the route. So let me just demonstrate that for you. If I just unclip it from below, I swing it around here, and then I put my motor back where it was, then you see these wires now are going to need to have that flexibility on it, so when it swings all the way round to the final position, that it doesn't get all snagged up. So that's the reason they've made them this particular length. So that's basically how I'm going to do it. Now the other thing to think about, I'll just remove these from this hole. The other thing to think about is this nut. This nut can be a bit of a killer on ESCs if you're not careful. If you actually just use the flat face of the ESC, if I just hold it up here, you can see that potentially that nut, I'll just try and zoom in a little bit, potentially that nut can get quite close to some of the wires. Now when you're using these ESC extensions, you can see that actually there's kind of a lump, and they've done it, whether this is deliberate or whether it was by accident, but either way I've placed them so there's kind of a high side and a low side, so this will actually clear that nut when you're moving it around. If you still feel that it's a little bit in the way, or if you're a little bit worried, the one thing that you can do, get a bit of foam board, get a bit of cardboard, something like that, and you just stick that to the underside here of your ESC. It just will move it away. It will just kind of raise the height a little bit, kind of hard to see in this, so it will just raise it up, and it will mean there's less chance of there being any rubbing on that nut. So let me just zoom back out there. Okay. So yeah, so they're the considerations when you're actually mapping out what you want to do with this. My advice is certainly we're going to mount up the motors first up. just to make sure that you've got the full swing and the full range and you're not going to get any snagging, anything like that. Then I would say get a bit of tape, strap it around your ESC so you're comfortable with the position of it, you're comfortable that you're not getting this nut in the way and it's not rubbing against anything. And once you're all happy with all of that, that's the point where you can then say, right, let's get the soldering iron out, let's get the cable cut to the length, and we're going to do that. So that will be the next stage. Okay, so now we're going to move on to just getting the ESCs ready to be mounted onto the arms. Now what I'm going to do is give them a bit of a spacer because I want to just avoid knocking into that nut potentially and just rubbing on it. This is an optional extra that you don't have to do, you can mount them straight onto it. Some people use heat shrink. To be honest, if I had the right amount of heat shrink I'd probably use it, but for me this is something that I used on the last one and it worked very well. Basically what we're going to end up with is something that looks like this. So we've got the ESC, we've got the coiled wire. Again, this is completely optional. If you want to chop the wire to length, as you've seen before, you can do that. I'm going to coil it, and I've literally then used just a bit of foam board here. It's 50mm by 24mm, and it just lays on the bottom of that, and then I've just taped around it. The idea is there's a bit of gap between the tape and that. There should be a bit of ventilation for it, shouldn't cause a problem, and obviously that will then be able to mount to the arm. To demonstrate what the arm looks like when it's all mounted, here's one I made earlier, as they say. So that's actually the motor mounted on there, the extension cable's on there. You can see that the wires are hanging down at the moment because I've put it through this first hole. I may choose to move it, I might do a bit of braiding on these, but ultimately the ESC, as you can see, again, all I've done is I've used some black insulation tape and I've just strapped all of that bundle together, and it's just held on there. The important thing is that the gap here needs to be maintained. So yes, I could use a cable tie, but if I have a thick cable tie, problem is when I come to swing the arm around, it's going to snag on that cable tie, and by using something like really thin heat shrink or tape, you can actually get it to close that a little bit further, and you can see there's an ever so slight gap there that just gives you that barrier, and it means that you can fold it all the way into the middle. Otherwise you can only fold it about here. Not that that's going to be a major problem, but like I say, this is something that I've done before and it works quite well. As you can see, when you do curve it all the way in, the wires, they're not taut, it's about the right length, I would say. I have braided the wires at the top here by the motor, but again, that's optional, and it may be a case of once I finish with it, what I'll do is I'll just strap these down a little bit better so there's a bit of flexibility, but that's what we're aiming for. So I'm going to continue just making the last one of those now so you can see how it's done. Nothing too complicated. All I'm going to do is get myself some insulation tape, decent amount of that, chop that, get my ESC and lay it down on top of it, and then what I do is I just make sure there's a little bit of a gap between the bullets and the end of the board, and then I just lay the tape down over the top of the E300 sticker, nice and flat like that. Give it a once around and up, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my wire, I'm going to wrap it around like this, pinch it in place, and then curl that tape back over and just pin it down. And again, as I'm doing this, the reason that I'm keeping this wire is because I know for a fact that I will probably end up using these motors and these ESCs for other projects, other videos, things like that. I do like to be able to move them, chop them around. I'd love to be able to keep them on there, but unfortunately I just can't afford to continue buying new sets for every model that I own, and frankly I can't store them once they're all built anyway all the time. Okay, so we've got another little bundle there, and that is going to end up on the underside of this about here. And what I'm doing is I'm going to actually attach them to the arms first. The reason being that what I want to do is I want to be able to make sure that this wire when I actually cut it is going to be kind of the right distance. So I'm literally going to snip it about there. I'm going to make it so I can just make it the right angle, and by doing that I know that there's a nice joint on there, it's going to be at the right angle, there's no stress or anything like that going onto it. It's going to be a bit fiddly, but it's always going to be a bit fiddly. So yeah, so that's what I'm going to do. So now what I'll do is I'll attach all 4 ESCs to the arms and we'll go from there. Okay, so now let's move on to the soldering part. Now before we do that, the one thing that we want to take a quick look at is the way that these DJI E300 wires actually work. Obviously some ESCs, if you're not using the DJI ones, they'll normally come with two wires. They'll just have a ground and a positive. However, as you can see here, if we will get in focus, this is kind of the format of the wires that you get with the E300s. So this is kind of the end wire that's on it, but if we strip it back, so this is just a piece that I've already chopped. If we strip it back, you can see that actually what they are is it's coaxial wire. So the negative or the ground is this coil around the positive. So what you've got to do is basically peel it back, and you need to then sort of bunch up the coax part of it, making sure that no little tiny strands are getting in the way, like so, and that's going to be your ground. And then obviously then you're going to strip the negative, the positive bit here. So as we can see on this one, if I just zoom this in, there, so that's a pre-prepared one that I've done already. This will be the first one. So I've got the positive is now been stripped, I've got the coaxial negative is there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-solder the pads here. So I'm going to put a glob of solder there after I've put some rosin flux on it, and then it's literally just a case of we're just going to lay these down into the solder. Jobs are good. And next thing we want to do after that, once we've done all 4 of the ESCs, is we want to get the PMUv2 powered up, and that's actually going to attach here where it says FCBEC. That is actually a 12 volt pad right there, so we're going to be able to use that for the PMUv2. So first and foremost, what I'm going to be using is I'm going to be using this is the resin flux pen, and I'm going to put a little glob of that on the pads. I'm using about 435 degrees on a temperature controlled soldering iron, which is quite hot. If you don't have a temperature controlled soldering iron, I strongly suggest that you maybe think about going out and getting one. Okay, a little glob of solder on there just to get heat to the pad. Preheat the pad. And then a nice dollop of solder. Okay, not my greatest work, but my soldering sucks anyway. Okay, so that's the soldering done. Not my finest work, and as I say, I'm absolutely rubbish at soldering, but it should be absolutely fine. One thing that you do need to be very careful with, because this braided wire is basically lots of sections of very small wire, you can see there's a bit of sort of swarf lying around here. What you need to be careful with is that none of these tiny little strands on the negative actually can arc onto the positive. So what I'm going to do is fire up a hot glue gun, and I'm just going to dab some hot glue around the edges of the positive, just to make sure that if anything did try and sort of fall off or get loose on here and try and penetrate onto that, that it can't spark out. And obviously the last thing we want to do is short out the electrics. So so that's the final stage of the actual soldering that's going to be done, and once that's there, then it's just a case of getting the PMUv2 soldered on. Okay, so that is my PMUv2 soldered on. Now as you can see, what I've done is I've used 3.5mm bullets, and that is because my PMUv2, which is here, I also put some 3.5mm bullets on there a while ago. Just means that I can swap it out, I can move it about again if I wanted to use it on, say, a Phantom or something like that. It gives me the option of doing it. A little bit more cable than I'd like, but still, at least that's now going to be like that. So that is the soldering all done now. So now the top frame is all built, the next thing we want to consider is getting our NASA flight controller fitted to the base plate. Now there's a few things that you really need to consider very carefully before you go doing this. As you can see, there's a nice big hole here which in theory allows you to gain access. What you need to bear in mind though, as I'll do a dry fitment, is when you actually slot this frame together, that hole there, if you've got big fingers, is very constrictive. It is workable, but it's better to get everything done before you actually slot the two together, in my opinion. And for that reason, you also need to consider, if I leave that right there, so I've just left it right centered in that hole, if I now remove the top frame and leave it right at that point here, now what we've got to consider is the firewall. Now the firewall is the thing that keeps the battery, which is going to sit here, from smashing into the flight controller. And obviously you don't want that to happen. If there's any movement on your flight controller, it can cause all sorts of problems. Now that fits, okay, all fine, that's actually there, no problem. Hang on 1 second, what we need to do is we need to get a rather chunky cable from our PMUv2 here into the back of the NASA. As you can see, there's no way that that's actually going to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in, and we'll give you a little better indication of just how much of a problem that is. So if I were to in fact try and slot this in, you can see there's a significant overhang into the battery bay, which obviously you don't want. You don't want anything hitting that cable. So what you're going to end up doing, because you've got much more space here, is actually mounting it pretty much using this area here. So more like about this, which is absolutely fine. That gives you a little bit more room, but let's just check again. So I'm going to plug this into the Expo, which is where it's going to be, and you'll see, in fact I'll do it through the firewall. So let's say we're going to have it about there, and then I'm going to move this through the firewall and plug it in, and as you can see, that's still not really leaving us a huge amount of wiggle room. Now that is a bit of a problem, and my suggestion to you is, if you are going to be using the PMUv2 cables, and I am going to touch on this in a moment as well, on what cables you will be using, then what I would suggest you do is you actually take a craft knife and you very, very, very delicately chop off these little sections here, just the little rib sections on the sides. And then what you do is you take some shrink wrap, you bend over the wire back on itself, and this is my V2 LED, so this is a perfect example because this is going in there too, and then you shrink wrap it back on itself. Now what that allows us to do, if I just squeeze this in here, is it now, I'm going to remove the firewall for the moment, means that if I slide that in there, you can see that there is much more space for it. However, we're still going to need to be about there. Now that leaves us plenty of space at the back of the NASA. That's fine, but what we've also got to consider is at the front, this is where all your ESCs are going to be mounted. So let me just get that more central. So when it's there, this is just a Y cable, but it's just to give a demonstration of a servo wire going into the front. So if we've got an M1 plug there, and then if we bend that back, now you can see, if we look at this line here, this is our front bulkhead. There's not a lot of space there, so you really need to give this some close consideration before you fit the NASA. If you just throw it on there in the centre, you're going to find that this firewall is either unusable or is going to get in the way. This is the best thing that I've found so far, is to do this modification, and I am going to show you how to do that modification in a moment. And also just bear in mind that at the front here you could go maybe that far, but that's still pushing your luck as to whether you could get the actual genuine unmodified cable on there. So I would suggest do the modification on this cable. Now a few people are now going to be thinking, well hang on, what's this little thing come in the box for? Now this is something that needs to be paid close attention to, and I'm just going to start a separate video on that now. So this here is our piggyback cable, a very important piggyback cable. What it does is it takes GPS data and it basically takes it through these pins on the input and it takes it to the PDB board. That means that your OSD, your Easy OSD on the XuGong will get information from the NAZA's GPS. Now, I am using here in front of you a NAZA V2. It has been discovered that if you use a NAZA V2, that you of course will have a NAZA PMUv2. Now if you've got a NAZA PMUv2, your GPS goes in this port here. So we take our GPS here, so we've got our standard GPS puck. That would normally, on any normal setup, that would plug into our PMUv2. Then we would plug this end into the NAZA and everything's fine. Because we need to get this piggyback cable in place, there's two ways of doing it. Now if you've got a NAZA V2 and you're using a PMUv2, this piggyback cable has to go here. If you're using a NAZA-M Lite and you haven't done any upgrade, I know there's an upgrade going around for NAZA-M Lite to NAZA V2, but if you're just using NAZA-M Lite and you're not using a PMUv2, and the important thing is the PMUv2 element of it, then all you do is you just plug this piggyback cable directly into the expo port here, like so, and then your GPS puck will go straight into the back of that. If you're using a NAZA V2 like I am, then what we're going to do is we're going to have the PMUv2, that cable is going to go into the expo port just like it normally would do, like so. X3 here goes into the X3 port just underneath, like so. And then again what we do is we disconnect our GPS from the PMUv2, piggyback cable slides in to the same slot that the GPS came from, and then GPS of course slots in to the piggyback cable there. It may sound daft, you may not sort of grasp why, but if you put that piggyback cable into the back of the NAZA, so if you actually bridge the gap between the cable that comes out of the PMUv2 and you put it here, you will not get GPS signal on your XuGong. So it's a very important thing to bear in mind. The reason is that basically the input, and this has all come from ImmersionRC, they've given me this information after I had the problem originally. The input here is USART, and the input out of the PMUv2 via the Expo is a CAN format. You may not know what I'm talking about, but trust me. Anyway, if you do it the wrong way around, you won't get that. If you're using NAZA-M Lite, then you can just plug your piggyback cable straight into the Expo, and then you can plug your GPS puck straight into it. If you're using NAZA V2 and you've got a PMUv2, then it has to be this configuration. So bear that in mind. And with that, therein lies another problem, that because we've got the GPS, the chunky PMUv2 cable, we've still got this firewall issue here. So I'm going to have to do the same modification that I did on my cable here, and I'll show you how to do that now. So to modify the cable so you've got more room in the NAZA bay, very simple. Take a craft knife, make sure it's a really nice sharp craft knife, and the key is patience and being very delicate. What we're looking to do is we're basically just looking to remove these two ribs at the bottom here. So all we want to do, don't go too close to the cable to begin with, and just slice down, straight down, and then just take a little nick out of it, and they should then peel away. So you see that's exposed the cable, and what we want to do is we want to work it until we've got as close to the cable as possible, but obviously not slicing into the cable. So again, you see no slice of the cable, we're just taking away the ribs. You do want to be very careful because we don't want to damage the wire. If you do cut into it, it's not going to be the end of the world. The cable's not going to not work, but you are going to just want to be a bit careful with it, because you don't want to actually slice through them. Okay, so now you can see we've got the top bits now. What we can do is we can just peel them back and peel them back, and then again we can take our craft knife and delicately, cutting away from the cable and your fingers, cut through that plastic and remove that. So that has got us that far. Now I would suggest going as far as you possibly can. If you're feeling brave, which I do at the moment, then I'm going to go a little bit further and take that last nodule out. Okay, a little bit left, like so. And then this one. Like so. A little bit left on the bone there. Okay, same again with the top bit. Just going to bend that back with my finger. In fact, I can probably rip that off with my finger. Maybe a little bit of knife. Now a lot of people won't like doing the modification like this, but it's a lot better than actually having to have no firewall, because in the event of a bump, that battery has got a lot of inertia in it, and you don't really want that damaging a rather expensive flight controller. Ultimately, if you did have any snafus with doing this little modification, then you would just need to get a soldering iron out and make a new cable for it. Okay, so that's absolutely fine for the purposes that we're doing there. So as you can see, that's now a lot shorter. Demonstrate how much shorter, I'll just grab the GPS cable in. So this is the one that's on my GPS. As you can see, that whole bottom section has now gone. Okay, fantastic. So now what we want to do is we want to bend it back over itself, and I make sure that the tabs are on the bottom for this. So we're going to bend it back over itself. You'll notice, you'll probably be able to see the cables poking out now, if you can see that. Not a problem, because we're going to protect it. So we poke it back over itself, like so. And then what we want to do is get yourself some heat shrink. Obviously I'm going to want to cut this to length. So I'm going to want about maybe there. Nice and tight. And then we want to slide that heat shrink on, making sure we can still push the whole cable in, like so. And then we're going to want to tighten that all up so it's nicely pinned down. Just need to get our lighter, making sure there's no chance of setting fire to anything here, and we're just going to shrink this all down. What I'm going to do is just trim that down a little bit more. Okay. And there we go, that's all heat shrinked nice and tight. So that will now give us plenty of space behind the NAZA. And that's going to be the final outcome. So we've got the LED here and we've got the PMU there. And if we just bring in our lower board. That means that we can now have our firewall in place here, and we've got plenty of space at the front for everything there as well. So with that in mind, now we can consider that as being the place that we want our NAZA, and we can stick that down. What we've got to do with that, I'm just using some No More Nails tape. The NAZA does come with a sticky pad there, a 3M sticky pad. You can use that, no problem. Yeah, make sure it's nice and sealed down, and just get it in place like this. Rip the tape off and then give it a stick. Okay, so that is the NAZA all sealed down in place there. You can see underneath that there's plenty of area to bite into on the CF board with the No More Nails strip that I've used there. So both of the plugs are now in place, and I can just demonstrate there that the firewall now goes snugly up against them and doesn't push. And as you can see, just using this little Y cable, there's plenty of room to play with there. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to take our assembled frame with the ESCs and everything soldered up and all ready to go, and we want to fit all of the anti-vibration spheres. As you can see, I've done all of them apart from this one here, so I can demonstrate how to do it. Very simple. If I just spin it around, all you do, take the top part of it, squeeze it, push it through, and if you push hard enough, you'll see it will pop through. That's the easy part, getting them into the red board, into the PDB, and it gets a little bit more complicated when we actually mount it to the top. So now, bear in mind orientation. So we've got the front is going to be here, the back is going to be here. Now what we want to do is fit another few cables. This one here, this black cable here, this is for the video transmitter, and that is going to go into this slot here. So turn it round, and you want on these little Pico boards, if it will focus, there we go, we want the little pins showing up. So this is the side that shows down, so we want pins up. Let it refocus there, and we want to push that in to this bit here. And the other end of this is going to go to the connector that's on the back of an ImmersionRC video transmitter, or a Fat Shark video transmitter. So we're not going to use the main pins on those like you would on most models. We're actually going to use the little connector that is on the back of that, and we'll show you that in a moment. So that's going to go in there. Then we've got these two servo wires. Both of these want to go into these ports here, and one of these is going to go to X2 on the NAZA, and the other one is going to go to the receiver. And actually it doesn't matter which one goes to which, because it's basically a pass-through through the board, so you don't need to worry yourself too much with that. Just got to consider which is easiest for you. And finally, the other thing that we're going to want to do, and this is one of the key ones, is we want our pass-through board here, our pass-through GPS cable. So turn that the right way around, and that's going to go into this port here, GPS. So again, if you're running NAZA-M Lite, this is going to go into the Expo port of your NAZA, and your GPS device is going to plug straight into the back of it. If you're running NAZA V2, this is going to go into your PMUv2 into the GPS port, and your GPS is going to go into the back of that. So just bear that in mind. So we've got to consider that when it comes to actually fitting this all together. So that's basically all of the cables connected. The other thing that we've got here is the video transmitter power. We've already got one end of that connected to the video transmitter, so we'll be able to plug that up once we've actually moved the top board on top of it. So that's going to be the next stage. Okay, so now we come to the challenging task of mating the top frame to the PDB board. Now, as you can see, I've put all of my anti-vibration spheres through these holes. There's a personal preference. People sometimes might want to put them through the frame first. My personal preference is I like to sort of poke at them with something, you know, blunted like this. And the problem is, if you poke at them with them the other way round, you're sort of poking at the board itself, and you've got a few components points, especially around these corners here, that you really don't want to get too close to with something like this, because you could really damage it. So my personal preference is to actually leave all of the spheres off the frame, put them all onto the PDB, and then we're going to sort of lay the PDB board underneath the frame, and then we're going to poke around to try and do it. It is a challenge, there is no denying it, there's no easy way of doing it, there's nothing that's going to make it an easy job, but it's very rewarding once you've actually done it. So we're going to take the frame, and now what we want to do, we've got all of our cables here, so one of these is going to go to the flight controller, so this is going to go into the X2 port of flight controller. This one is going to go off to the receiver. Doesn't matter which one does which. I prefer moving this one to the receiver because I can channel it through this anti-vibration sphere here. So this one is actually going to go through this rectangle shape hole here. I've plugged in, as you can see here, my video transmitter. I've plugged in the connector at the top there, and that's going to come through this hole, and that's going to go down. So because it's a nice long cable, I can actually connect that, one of the first things to do. So that's going to go in this port here. And make sure we've got it the right way around. Okay, we've also got the GPS pick-off cable here, which is this one, and that's going to come up through the main hole here. So we'll pop that up there and just kind of hook it on. Then we've got the ESCs. Now the M1 and M2 I'm going to put through these holes, kind of hard to see here. I'm going to put through that hole there and the corresponding one on the other side, so it comes in near the front bulkhead. So one there and two through there, and then the other two are just going to come through the main square. Nothing too complicated about them. Just try and make sure you don't snag any cables or anything like that. Okay, and then yeah, we want this one coming through this rectangle here. Right, so it doesn't look particularly appealing, but that is all the cables where they need to be through here. And obviously this has got to go off to the NAZA V2 in a minute for me. Obviously if you are using a NAZA Lite, just to reiterate, a NAZA Lite, it will be this bit that goes into the Expo port of the NAZA, and this will be plugged into via the GPS. If you're using NAZA with a PMUv2, this will go into the PMUv2 into the GPS port, and your GPS will plug in here, and then the other end of the PMUv2 will go into the Expo port of the NAZA, just to remind you of that. We've got the video transmitter power, that can be plugged in. That's already plugged into the back of the video transmitter, and that is this port there. Okay, so video transmitter is all plugged up. So that's everything pretty much plugged up where it needs to go. Now here comes the tricky part, and there's no easy way for me to show this because it needs to be kind of clutched fairly close. But basically what we've now got to do is we've got to get these anti-vibration spheres, these chaps under here, we've got to get them through the frame. Now there are a number of ways that you can do this. I'll see if I can get one for you here. Basically what we want to do is we want to kind of put a bit of compression on it, and we want to tease one corner, a bit like that, one corner through, slide it, and then try and get a finger in the other side and just kind of squash it up. And my personal preference is to use a tool like this, a blunted hex driver, and to just kind of slide it through under the frame, again being very delicate with the PDB and just sort of kneading it around the edges like so. Put a bit of compression on it, and then using your finger just kind of pluck. If you pluck away, you will find that eventually it will pop through. So we're going to do that on all of them. It's fiddly, you're going to be swearing, cursing. Be very careful not to stab into your board. Don't be too fussed if you're scratching away at the laminate on the carbon fibre. Better do that than to do it on the PDB board, which is why I opt to do it this way round. But do this side first, I would suggest, then this one here. These are the easiest ones to get to. The middle ones are the hardest ones by far and away, again, just be very careful with how you do. If you do it a consistent side by side, then it makes it a little bit easier. So we'll give that a go and come back once that's done. Okay, so proof that it can be done. That's all of them actually in place. So that is the PDB board now in place where it needs to be. So the next thing that we need to do is get our baseboard with the NAZA on it, and we need to lower it down on top of it, and then we can secure it up. Okay, so now it comes to actually getting the NAZA, which is of course already attached to our base plate, in place, plugged in, and everything positioned. Now again, this is a bit of a fiddly one. You've just got to give it a bit of thought and plan your best route. Obviously the M1, M2, M3, M4 ports have to be filled at the front of the NAZA, so they've got to go on there. So that's one thing that you've got to consider. The other thing you need to do is we need to get this one into X2. This is coming from the board, and we also need to make sure that the PMUv2 plugs into the back as well as the LED, and that they've got ways of escaping out of the frame if needs be. Now, just to demonstrate what I have found to be probably the best way and the best place to mount the PMUv2, especially because I'm using it and it needs to be plugged into the pick-off cable. Once this is all down like this, my intention will be to mount the PMUv2 using a sticky pad just here, so just above the firewall area. I'm going to put it this way round so the CAN bus port faces towards the NAZA. The power connections go in down here already, so that's going to make it easier for that. The pick-off cable is going to come up through this hole, through the main bulkhead hole, and then plug in to the GPS there. And then this cable here is going to run back in through the bulkhead, and then it's going to plug into the expo port around the side there. So that's the intention. Now, with that in mind, the best thing to do for that reason, because we know it's going to come in through the side bulkhead, is to actually poke the PMUv2 through the side bulkhead, and now this is the point where we want to connect everything up to the NAZA at the back of the NAZA. So we want expo port here, so let's do the bottom ports first. So we want X3, so this is coming from the PMUv2, X3. We then want X2 filled by this one, which is coming, this is the PPM from the XuGong into X2. We then also want the expo port from the PMUv2. Like so, a bit difficult for you guys to see unfortunately, but I can assure you that is in expo. So that's all of the connections at the back of the NAZA apart from the V2 LED. And of course the V2 LED, we've got to think, where do we want the cable to come out of it. It's going to be situated on that side of the board because it's got this little holding that I've got for it. So I'm probably going to make life fairly simple, and I'm going to put it actually out through the main hole here. So I'm just going to slot it in through there. It's going to come up and it's going to go sideways. I can choose to do that differently if needs be, but that's then going to plug in. Again, unfortunately can't show you this very easily, but that is going into the V2 LED port in the back of the NAZA. Like so. Okay, so that is all of my rear mounted parts poking through. Now what we need to do is we need to get the pick-off cable through this bulkhead as well. So to do that, I'm going to feed it around and under and through, trying not to put too much tension onto the cable. Okay, and with that in place, so with that just loosely sort of poking out through there, not putting any pressure, and if you wanted to you could undo it from the board, it's not too difficult to get back in place, but I would advise leaving it connected for the time being. Now what we've got to deal with is the front of the NAZA, and basically all we've got to do is M1 to M1, M2 to M2, M3 to M3, etc, etc. So M1 is the far side here. I would suggest you start with M4 first. So M4 to M4, 1, 2, 3, 4, M3 to M3, M2 to M2, I've left this cable quite short, I might need to lengthen it a little bit. M2 to M2, just so you can see what I'm doing there. So these are the ports going in here, and finally M1 into M1, like so. And that is all of our ESC connections in place where they need to be, and we just want to make sure that we can close all of this up now. So we've then got the pick-off cable that's coming out here, that's going to go to our V2, PMUv2, but we're now in a position where we can actually push all of this down. So all you need to do, you've got these little nodules underneath, let me zoom out, here, these little nodules from my finger here, and they're going to plug into the actual holes, into the rubber feet holes. So if you push them down gently, you should discover that everything, bulkhead and everything like that, with a bit of wiggle, should line up pretty much okay and should snap together. Now this is where you want to just double check, lift it up, double check, make sure you haven't got any cables that are snagging, anything that's going to cause you a problem. We've got our PMUv2's got to be fished up and around here, so that's going to come up and around here like so. So that's going to be alright. Have I got enough space for my GPS? So pick-off cable goes into the PMUv2 like so. So that's fine. The GPS cable is going to go into that, so I'm probably going to end up mounting it there. What I don't want is I don't want this getting snagged on the LED, so I'll move that through there. Okay, so that's going to leave that with enough slack if I put it just about there, and then I'm going to actually probably stick that down with the GPS port plugged into it. So that's all fine, so I'm happy with all of that. So now it's a case of getting the frame actually sort of clipped together. And the best way to do that is to grab your screws and just basically go round the corners, start at one end and then just gently do one by one, and that's what I'll do right now. Okay, so that is all the frame screws now in place, so everything is where it needs to be. All we've now got to do is just stick this V2 down here, this PMUv2, and we need to plug a few things in, and then we're going to be good to go. So that is pretty much everything done now. So we've got our transmitter, receiver even, we've got our GPS is all mounted up. We've got the PMUv2 is put on the underside. We've got the GPS cable, as you can see, leading off to that, and I've secured it with a cable tie. Cable runs up there and it goes to the stalk. And other than that, we've got the V2 LED all secured and mounted now as well, and everything's all plugged up. So the one last thing that we want to do, if I just unfold the frame slightly, is we've got a couple of these little retaining clips to go on, and the suggestion is that you put them through these middle holes here. So one goes through there, one goes through there, and then these little clips just attach to the bottom of them right there, and you just got to push them on and they should just go click. There we go, like that. So that is the build all finished up and done. Once you've done your build, as we look at a few of these photos, what you need to consider is getting your firmware up to date. To do that, the best way of doing it is to head over to the ImmersionRC website, go to the XuGong V2 Pro page, scroll down to the bottom, and that's where it will tell you any new firmware updates that are around. At the time of this video going online, the ImmersionRC Tools version 1.41 was required. That will allow you to see the specific XuGong V2 Pro panel on the left hand side at the bottom. Within that panel you will see options for changing your milliamp hours on your pack, doing some voltage calibration for the OSD, and changing a couple of settings with some diagnostic stuff as well. Other considerations that you want to make from firmware point of view is if you're using Easy UHF, to get the best out of your XuGong V2 Pro, especially with easy antenna tracker and things like that, you want to make sure that you update the firmware for the receiver to version 1.51 or above. You don't actually have to have the transmitter on version 1.51 or above. However, no doubt by the time you've looked at this video, there may well be new updates. So again, head over to ImmersionRC website, go to Easy UHF, go to that page, scroll to the bottom and see if there's any relevant updates that are required. Other than that, all you've got to do now is get a battery pack charged up and get out there and do some flying and have some fun.